The Chicago morning crept into Jack Mercer's studio like smoke from a tailpipe, slow and viscous and tinged with anxiety. The light didn't cut through the darkness. Rather, it replaced it, turning the blackness of the night into a dirty gray that made everything look blurry, as if someone had splashed water on an old photograph. A single ray of sunlight broke through the murky glass, coated with dust, fingerprints, oil stains, and forgotten time. It cut through the gloom and landed on the lift, illuminating the rusty frame of an old Ford, standing like a crippled soldier, naked, with the guts of the engine exposed, held together by cables and supports, waiting to be set in motion again. Jack stood over him, hunched over, as if he were not only fixing a car but trying to put himself back together. His fingers, coated in thick black grease, gripped the wrench as if it were the last anchor holding him to this world. The lines on his palms merged with cuts from days gone by, ones that never healed, but simply became part of his hand. It was cool in the workshop, even with the heater on in the corner, an old, noisy stove that only pretended to work. The air was heavy with the smell of gasoline, oil, and rust, soaking into the walls, into the clothes, into the skin itself. The smell was familiar, almost native, a mixture of the past that never goes away and the present that won't let you forget. On the peeling wall, where team posters and old photographs had once hung, there was now only a radio. Small and dusty, it murmured a raspy tune. Blues, Stevie Ray Vaughan's voice, cracked like an old vinyl record. The guitar groaned, the strings wept, and it sounded like someone was singing his thoughts. Jack sighed. Not because he was tired, but because he didn't know why he was still breathing. He hadn't slept. For the second night in a row. His eyes hurt, but he didn't complain. He wasn't the type to complain. He was the type to fix things, people, engines, his own head. Even if everything was broken long ago. In the corner of the workshop, next to empty boxes and an old tire rack, sat his jacket. That one, worn, with leather inserts, dried blood on the lining, a secret compartment in the inside pocket. It contained more than just documents, it contained a past, and perhaps answers. He glanced at the wall clock. The hands stretched like drops of oil on glass. Cole's reception was in the evening, and now silence, oppressive like before a storm. He looked back down at the engine. He inserted the key. He turned it. Click, dull. He knew, not now, but soon, the machine will come to life. As will he. Because in this city, under this sky, in this cold concrete, he still has something to do. The shop was his sanctuary, but it was also his cage. The walls were cracked and oil-stained, bearing the marks of decades of work. Handprints, tool marks, yellowed newspaper clippings with headlines about the Indy 500. A sagging chair covered in worn leather sat in the corner, next to a box of impact wrenches, spanners, and coils of wire, as tangled as Jack's thoughts had been in recent months. Here, in this cramped space, he felt both safe and on edge, a feeling he had come to expect from years of service. His life had once been a whirlwind of adrenaline, night missions in deserts where the smell of gunpowder mingled with sweat, orders whispered, gunshots that drowned out his heartbeat. Now he fixed carburetors and changed oil for local taxi drivers, their faces a blur. Jack wiped his hands on a cloth soaked in solvent and glanced at his watch, exactly 6 in the morning. The city outside the window was just beginning to wake up. The honking of cars, the creaking of trams, the occasional voices of morning passers-by. He had barely slept that night, replaying the previous evening in his head. Emily had returned home after midnight, her heels tapping on the parquet floor like a metronome counting down to the inevitable. She muttered something about work, about meetings, but her eyes, those cold, gray-blue pools, avoided his gaze. Jack knew that look. He had seen it during interrogations, in the faces of people who were hiding something. But he did not ask. Not then. The back door creaked open, breaking the silence. Emily walked in, her steps cautious, as if she were treading through a minefield. She held a manila envelope and a cup of coffee from the diner across the street. The morning light caught her face. Pale skin, shadows under her eyes, lips pressed into a thin line. She was wearing a sharp charcoal suit, a knee-length skirt, a white blouse with a high-collar clothes that screamed control, restraint, a woman who didn't allow herself weakness. She smoothed her hair back, tucking a stray strand behind her ear, and set the envelope and coffee down on the paper-strewn desk. Emily looked as if every morning she began with an endless list of tasks and an internal struggle with something she would not name out loud. Tall, with a straight posture, as if brought up under the constant gaze of a strict teacher, she radiated a cold composure. Her movements had the precision of a surgeon and the weariness of a person who had long since stopped expecting something good. Her eyes, gray-green, piercing, attentive, seemed to be looking for weak spots in the world around her. She did not tolerate disorder, but was forced to live among chaos. People in the office said that she carried everything on herself, but no one knew what price she paid for it every day. "Good morning," she said, standing at the entrance, her voice even, measured, almost rehearsed. But there was still a barely perceptible crack in it, like old porcelain about to crack under its own weight. Jack didn't turn around. He kept fiddling with the engine as if he hadn't heard, or pretended he hadn't. His shoulders were tense, his fingers gripping the wrench tighter than necessary. The metal slipped slightly, almost stripping the threads, and he felt a current run through his veins, not a physical one, but that same familiar one, instinct. Something was wrong. The air was thicker, like before a thunderstorm. That silence you could cut with a knife. He felt it on his skin, like he felt an ambush approaching when he lay in the bushes in the rain with a rifle and knew that if he blinked, he wouldn't wake up. "Morning," he finally muttered, not looking at her. His voice was low and dry. Emily stepped inside, her heels clicking softly on the concrete workshop floor. She was wearing a coat he hadn't seen before, dark blue and expensive. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, her makeup barely visible, too carefully put together, like she was about to perform, or be interrogated. "I thought you wouldn't be here at this time," she said. A pause. "I left you some coffee." She set the paper cup on the edge of the workbench, next to her tools. The smell of caramel latte clashed with the rust, grease, and harsh blues coming from the radio. He glanced at the coffee out of the corner of his eye. He didn't take it. He didn't thank me. "Are we going to talk?" he asked, finally straightening up. His voice was even, but there was a steel ring in it. Emily looked down, for a split second, but it was enough. Later. This evening, she hesitated. After the event at Cole's. "I'll come home. We'll talk. About everything." "Okay," he said, and turned away again. Back to the engine, as if what he was fixing mattered. Emily stood silently at the table. Her fingers fiddled nervously with the edge of the envelope, and Jack saw several bills fall out $100 bills, neatly tied with a rubber band. His gaze lingered on the money. Cash was rarely paid in his shop, much less in such large amounts. Customers, usually taxi drivers or owners of used Chevys, brought in crumpled 20s or paid by card. But this was different. "Where did the money come from?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but a spark of suspicion was already flaring inside him. Emily froze, her hand hovering over the table. She looked at him, and something flickered in her eyes: fear, calculation. But then it was gone, hidden behind her usual mask of calm. "My colleague has an overflow in the cash register," she answered, too quickly, too smoothly. "I decided to bring it here so I wouldn't have to carry it around with me. You know how that happens." Did he know? Jack knew the smell of lies. He knew the sound of words that tried to hide the truth. His fingers tightened around the rag until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to ask more, wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake the answers out of her, but instead he just nodded. He was not the kind of man to make a scene. Not anymore. Once he might have stormed into a room with a gun drawn, but here in this shop he was just Jack Mercer, the mechanic, the husband trying to hang on to what little he had left. "Are you busy today?" he asked, softening his tone, trying to bring the conversation back to normal. A smile touched his lips, but it was taut as a string. "The usual," Emily said, looking away. She picked up the tablet from the table, her fingers shaking slightly. "Lots of things to do. But tomorrow, Tomorrow is our anniversary. I made reservations at Lincoln. It'll be the same as before. Like before. The words cut like a knife. Jack remembered their first anniversary. Emily in a flowing dress, laughing as they danced to street jazz on the boardwalk. She had called him my hero then, and he had believed it was true. Now her words sounded empty, like a burned-out light bulb. He saw the line on her forehead, barely noticeable, but so familiar a sign of worry she could never hide. He nodded as if he agreed, although a storm was already raging inside. "Okay," he said, turning back to the engine. His voice was quiet, but inside him, a storm was already raging. He didn't want to be the husband who rummaged through his wife's things, checked her phone, and asked questions. He didn't want that sticky mistrust to settle between them. But it was already there, living in the shadow of every glance, every unspoken word. Last night, he came into the house a little later than usual. The light in the bedroom was off, but from behind the half-open door, he heard a hurried rustling sound, fabric sliding over skin, heels tapping on the floor, a wardrobe creaking. She was changing, quickly, as if she was in a hurry to hide something. When he came in, she was already lying on the bed, in her pajamas, her hair down, as if everything was fine. He didn't ask. He didn't want to, or didn't dare. But this morning he found an envelope in his car, not the one she'd brought with her coffee, a different one, with writing on it, not in her handwriting, but with her name. Inside was money, lots of it, too much. Not a stash, not savings, and definitely not her paycheck. He held the envelope in his hands as she spoke of Lincoln and, like before, and felt his confidence crack. This something that had entered their home, their relationship, was more than just an omission. It was like a crack in glass, tiny at first, but growing each day, spreading like a web across their lives. He wanted to ask, "What's going on, Emily?" But he was afraid to hear the answer, because maybe the worst thing is to know the truth, which can never be forgotten. Emily gathered her things, her tablet, her wallet, her keys, and headed for the door. Her back was straight, like a soldier going into battle. She stopped at the threshold and turned around. "Everything is under control, Jack," she said, and there was steel in her voice. "Don't worry." Control. It was a word she repeated too often. It was her shield, her mantra. But to Jack it was a warning. He nodded without looking at her, and heard the door slam behind her. The workshop was silent again, except for the creaking of the lift and the distant whistle of a train. Jack stood by the engine, but his mind was elsewhere. He remembered Baghdad, 2008. Night, heat, the smell of burning fuel. His squad had been tasked with tracking down a smuggler who was smuggling cash across the border. They had found him in an abandoned warehouse, surrounded by boxes of money. Jack had held him at gunpoint while his partner, Liam Hayward, searched the stash. Liam had laughed, saying that money was always dirt, always someone's blood. Jack had dismissed his words at the time. Now they sounded like a prophecy. He walked over to the table where the envelope lay. His fingers brushed the paper, and he felt his heart beat faster. He didn't open it. Not yet. But he knew that this envelope was the key to what Emily was hiding, the key to something that could ruin his life. At that moment, the workshop door creaked again, and Tony, a guy in his mid-20s, in a black t-shirt with a rock band logo, the ever-present tattoo of a snake coiled around his neck, and a grin that seemed glued on permanently, staggered in. He was lugging a heavy plastic box of parts, barely missing the door frame. His boots squeaked on the stained concrete floor, leaving a trail of moisture from the street behind them. "Boss, have you seen what's going on outside?" he began, struggling to put the box down. He exhaled loudly, dusted his hands, and turned to Jack. "Some lunatic in a Dodge nearly knocked over a trash can at the turnoff. Screams that the brakes are dead, like his ex. Said there was smoke coming out, and the pedal was to the metal. Want me to take a look?" Jack looked from the engine to Tony, as if returning from afar. He could still feel the echo of Emily's words, the smell of coffee that still hung in the air. But life went on. Cars broke down. People waited for repairs. He looked at the guy, too talkative, too loud, but with hands that knew what to do. Tony could talk all the time, but when it came to nuts and bolts and belts, he worked like a clock. Sometimes Jack wished he'd hired him. Sometimes he was grateful he'd been there, especially on those days when he was barely holding on. "Get to it," Jack said shortly, returning his gaze to the Ford. "And check the oil. If you forget again, I'll deduct it from your paycheck." "Come on, boss, that was once," Tony drawled, already standing up. "Well, twice. Okay, 3. But who's counting?" He grabbed his gloves, pulled them on with a jerk, and headed toward the Dodge that had pulled up and was smoking at the entrance like an enraged dragon. "And one more thing," Jack said, without looking up. "If the client is too talkative, write them down. Names, numbers, everything." Tony turned around and chuckled. "You're in CIA mode again, aren't you?" "Just be careful," Jack snapped. Okay, Tony muttered, heading for the car. "Whatever you say, Commander." When he left, the workshop was quiet again. Only the dull blues continued to flow from the radio, and the raindrops, like a metronome, pounded on the tin canopy. Jack was left alone with the noises of the city, the engines, and his thoughts, which were again drawn to Emily, to Cole, in the evening. Towards a finale he cannot avoid. Tony grinned, winked, and walked away to the car. Jack watched him go, feeling a chill growing inside. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Not now. He walked back to the desk, picked up the envelope, and shoved it into the drawer, locking it. Whatever it was, he would figure it out. But not now. Now he needed time. Time to figure out what to do next. He stepped outside and breathed in the damp Chicago air. The sky was covered with gray clouds, and the city seemed as tired as he was. Jack shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and walked down the street, not looking around. Somewhere out there, beyond this fog, was the truth, and he would find it, even if it was the last thing he did. Chicago was sinking into the night like a ship in Inkai water. The streetlights cast dim pools of light on the pavement, and the distant hum of traffic mingled with the howl of the wind through the cracks in the windows of Jack Mercer's shop. He sat in his sagging chair upholstered in cracked leather and leafed through papers, repair invoices, customer records, tomorrow's schedule. The lamp over his desk flickered, casting an uneven light on the yellowed pages that made the scribbles in the corner of the notebook seem like codes hiding someone else's secrets. Every line, every check he had once considered routine, now pulsed with suspicion, like an open wound. Jack leaned back, his fingers still smelling of solvent gripping the armrests. The mechanical routine of the garage, the hum of the lights, the creaking of the cart, the hiss of the air jack usually lulled him, soothed him. But not today. The morning with Emily and her envelope of cash was on his mind. Those bills, they burned without even touching his skin. He knew what cash was, knew it better than he wanted to. In 2010, in Poland, everything changed. He was still wearing a uniform, working under contract for privateers' unofficial operations, black budgets. He returned from that raid with a wad of dollars hidden in the lining of his shoes. At the airport, he felt their weight, as if they were pulling him down. It was a special job, an operation that was not written about in the reports. He and Liam Hayward, his partner and almost brother, had tracked a courier to Lodz, carrying cash to fund the rebels in the south. The place was a cold, half-abandoned warehouse. The ceiling was dripping with moisture, and in the corner, someone long dead was oozing rot. But Jack didn't think about that. Liam held the courier at gunpoint, who was shaking and speaking Russian, interspersed with Spanish curses. Jack silently opened the boxes. There were dollars, mountains of them, neatly packed, vacuum-sealed, with ribbons, dirty, like everything they had been through. "Money is always dirt, Jack," Liam had said. He grinned as if he were telling a joke. "You can't wash it, even if it's from a bank, especially if it's from a bank." Jack didn't answer. He just did his job. As always, as he was taught. But now, all these years later, the words echoed in his head like a gunshot. He thought he had closed that chapter, that it remained somewhere between the armored vehicles and the faded dog tags in the storage box he kept under the stairs. And now here it was Emily, the envelope, the money she hadn't said a word about, and that same trembling in her fingers. Jack ran a hand over his face, feeling the cold sweat run down his skin. Whatever it was coming, like a storm, visible on the horizon but unstoppable. And maybe now he would have to be the man he had been back then, the one who asked the questions without saying them, the one who sought the truth, even if it was worse than a lie. Because he knew one thing: money doesn't just come, especially not like this. And if it does appear, it means someone will come for it. He put the papers down and rubbed his temples. The workshop was quiet, except for an old radio in the corner, blaring a jazz tune punctuated by static. The smell of gasoline and metal mingled with the dampness that permeated the walls. The shelves along the walls were piled high with tools: impact wrenches, screwdrivers, coils of wire, like tangled nerves. In the corner stood the blue metal case that Jack had once used to keep not only wrenches but cartridges as well. Now it seemed like a relic, covered in the dust of the past. Jack looked at it, feeling a chill growing inside. He knew he should check the envelope Emily had left him, but something stopped him, of fear that the truth would be worse than he was willing to accept. The workshop door creaked, and a figure appeared in the doorway. A tall, thin man in an expensive gray coat and a black hat with a wide brim. His face was half hidden by dark glasses, although the night had long since swallowed the city. Jack tensed, his hand instinctively tightening on the wire pliers lying on the workbench. The stranger did not look like a local, not like a taxi driver, not like the owner of a rusty pickup truck. He was an outsider, and Jack knew people like that. They showed up when trouble began. "Good evening," Jack said, trying to hide his surprise. His voice was even, but anxiety pulsed inside. "How can I help you?" The man slowly removed his glasses, revealing a razor-sharp gaze. His eyes swept around the workshop, lingering on the oil stains on Jack's shirt, on the tools, on the pile of papers. "Jack Mercer?" he asked, his tone commanding but not harsh, as if he was used to being obeyed. "Yes, and you?" Jack straightened up, still holding the tongs. Something about this man, his posture, his manner of speaking, reminded him of the officers he had encountered in the army, the ones who knew more than they were saying. "Detective Thomas Lang," the man replied, bowing his head slightly. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need to ask you a few questions." "FBI." The word hit like a gunshot in the silence. Jack felt his heart tighten. His world had long since narrowed to garages, rusty bolts, and the smell of gasoline. The last time he had dealt with the FBI was when he filed reports after operations, and that had been years ago. "Why now? Why him?" "What's wrong?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, but the slight tremor gave him away. He hated this feeling, the weakness that came over him when he wasn't in control of a situation. Lang stepped closer, his coat rustling slightly. He stopped at the table, his gaze sliding over the papers as if he could read more into them than was written there. "Have you ever noticed any discrepancies in your account?" he asked, looking Jack straight in the eye. "Transactions you didn't personally approve of?" Emily's phrase, "I have it all under control," flashed through Jack's mind. He looked down at the papers in his hands, the accounts he hadn't checked in months. The irony was bitter. He had always paid his taxes, hadn't been greedy, hadn't hidden his income. His business was small but honest, or so he thought. Now Lang's words made him doubt it. He remembered the envelope of money Emily had left behind and felt a cold fury building inside him. "No," he answered briefly, trying not to show his emotions. "I always check." Lang narrowed his eyes slightly, a glint of doubt or mockery flickering in his eyes. He folded his hands in front of him, his fingers tapping his wrist as if counting the time. "We've been told of large sums of cash regularly passing through your business," he said, his voice soft but steely. "We're just checking. Doesn't it seem odd to you that a mechanic would have that kind of money? Envelopes, bundles, cash?" The question hit like a bullet. Jack felt his hand shake, and the can of kerosene on the edge of the workbench wobbled, but did not fall. He wanted to answer sharply, wanted to say that it was none of his business, that he was not a criminal. But instead he forced himself to smile, the tired, strained smile he had learned over the years. "It's business as usual," he said, looking away. "Private deals, you know. Some clients don't trust banks. They pay cash. It's not always criminal." Lang looked at him for a few seconds, as if weighing each word. Then he nodded, barely noticeable, and glanced at his watch. "Good day, Mr. Mercer," he said. "Keep working. We'll be in touch." He turned to the door, but Jack couldn't resist. "Excuse me," he blurted out, more sharply than he intended. "We're not finished, are we?" Lang stopped and turned around. His face was impassive, but there was a shadow of a smile in his eyes. "If I need your help, I'll find you," he said. "No charges for now. Just a test. But if you remember anything odd, let me know." They exchanged a few more words, empty and polite, and then Lang disappeared into the night like a shadow. Jack was left alone, his fingers gripping the edge of the workbench so tightly his knuckles were white. He stared at the closed door, feeling the storm building inside him. Lang knew more than he was letting on, and Jack knew this was only the beginning. Later that night, Jack returned home. The door closed behind him with a dull click, and his footsteps echoed down the empty hallway as if the house did not recognize him. Outside, the street was the languid quiet of a big city after midnight. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional siren, the wind that seemed to scrape at the windows, as if something forgotten and restless were trying to get inside. He passed the kitchen, the empty sink, the lights off, the faint smell of cold coffee. Everything looked right, but it felt wrong, like something had been shifted half a millimeter, upsetting the usual symmetry of their life. Stopping at the bedroom door, he felt his hand slowly tighten around the doorknob. A dull noise came from inside a television, a news report. The announcer's voice, dry and distant, found at the scene. According to preliminary information, shooting began. Words to which Jack had developed immunity. But in this context at home, in their bedroom, they sounded alarming. He pushed the door. The light from the screen cut through the darkness, casting a cold glow across the room like a still from an interrogation room. Emily was sitting on the bed, wearing a black evening dress that hugged her figure. She hadn't worn it since that banquet 3 years ago. Then it had seemed a challenge, a triumph. Now it was a mystery. Her hair was loose, falling in a dark wave over her shoulders, as if she had just returned from a reception, or hadn't. She held a smartphone in her hands, scrolling through the screen with quick, nervous movements, as if she were trying to erase something important before he walked in. There were 2 glasses on the nightstand. One was nearly empty. The other was untouched. Jack noticed them right away, not because he was looking, but because he had learned to notice the unnecessary. His work, his past, everything taught him to see what others thought was random. The smell of grapefruit pungent, tart filled the room. The peel, carelessly left nearby, was almost defiant. He had always known that she ate grapefruit when she was nervous, or when she wanted to purge. The wine was red, rich, expensive, not something she drank alone. He stood frozen in the doorway, his shadow cast across the carpet between them. "Emily?" His voice was quiet, almost cautious, like a man stepping onto ice and not sure if he can stand it. She shuddered, as if only at that moment she realized that she was not alone. She looked up, and he saw something change in her instantly, as if she had quickly closed an inner door. Her eyes, previously bright, open, alive, were now cold, measured, like those of a negotiator who does not want to give in. "I didn't hear you," she said, and there was a lightness in her voice that she was obviously trying to pull on like a thin mask. "I'm tired. The hearing is tomorrow. The big day." He looked at her, at the dress, at the second glass. His brain was working, trying to assemble a puzzle from disparate parts. Everything was like an operation. Initial reconnaissance, anomalies, the behavior of the target. Only now the target was a woman he once knew better than himself, or thought he knew. He wanted to ask, "Who was here? Who were you waiting for? What are you hiding?" He wanted to reach out, to sit next to her, to take her hand. He wanted to bring back Emily from the beach, from their kitchen on Sunday, from that summer when they built the house. But he couldn't. The words, like bitterness on the root of his tongue, remained unspoken. "Good night," he said, simply, without accusation, without shrillness. "Good night," she replied, without looking up, and at that moment emptiness fell between them, soundless but almost tangible. He walked out. The door slammed behind him with a dry click, and it seemed as if the house had become even quieter. His fingers slid over the rough wall, old plaster, uneven like their lives these past months. He went down to the workshop. This was his sanctuary, his land. Here he felt that something else depended on him: motors, metal, the stench of grease and solvent. Simple, honest work. There were no secrets. He sat down on the bench, his head in his hands. The light from the table lamp seemed too yellow, too bright. Somewhere upstairs, in the bedroom, there was a woman who might have lied to him, or maybe just wasn't his anymore. And he knew, today is just the beginning. It will get darker from here. It was cold in the workshop. Not the usual night cold, but the kind that seeps through concrete walls, clings to bones, and gets under your skin. The air was thick with the smell of metal, machine oil, and the dampness that came from the concrete floor, saturated with years. There was no comfort here, no warmth. Only tools, iron, and memory. Jack sat down on a bench against the wall, which was streaked with rust and stained with tar, like blood on concrete. He leaned over, reached into the corner, and pulled out an old leather jacket. It smelled of sweat, tobacco, and the dust of the past. It was worn, with greasy seams, burnt in places, with crusted creases at the elbows. He kept it as a keepsake, or as a warning. He ran his fingers over the rough leather. Muscle memory recognized it before his mind did. This jacket had been with him in Bosnia, in Hungary, in Poland, in places where treaties meant less than a gun to your head, where life was measured in seconds, and there was no room for doubt. And here it is: Poland, 2010. Frosty air, dry, as if grinding the lungs from the inside. An abandoned industrial area, guards with Kalashnikovs, an old Tatra van near a warehouse. Jack saw everything as if through a haze. The memory returned not as images, but as sensations. The taste of metal on the tongue, the tension in the shoulders, the aiming grid in the eye. And Liam Hayward, his partner, the madman, the charisma, the man who used fear as fuel. He wasn't afraid of gunfire, of failure, of death. That night, when they stormed the warehouse, it was Liam who went first. His voice, hoarse and confident, echoed in his ear over the radio. "Let's go. Let's work." He distracted the guards intentionally. He stood in the light, as if he had allowed himself to be spotted. "We're like shadow and light, Mercer," he said later, back in the warehouse, leaning against a box of dollars. "Your precision. I'm noisy. We work together perfectly." Jack had just chuckled then. He hadn't paid attention. But now he was thinking, maybe Liam had figured it out first. Maybe that's why he'd left, disappeared. They said he went to Mexico, changed his name, forgot everything. Sometimes Jack heard rumors. Someone saw him on the coast in a bar with a shaved head and a new tattoo. But he never tried to verify it, because he knew Liam was gone forever, left the war where it belonged. And Jack stayed. He sighed. He put on his jacket slowly, like armor. The fabric embraced him like a ghost from the past. Whether it was warmth or a deception of the senses, he did not know. But at that moment, he stopped shaking. A familiar silence arose within him, internal, dense. The kind that comes before a fight, when you no longer doubt. He looked at the table, littered with old parts, and saw what was left of his former self, the tools that had saved lives and ruined them. Everything was there. Everything except one thing: support. Liam was gone. No one was there. This is his fight, his family, his home. If Emily is hiding something, he will find out. Calmly, methodically, without anger, just as he was taught. He opened the desk drawer and pulled out the envelope Emily had left. His fingers hovered over the flap. He knew there was money inside, maybe answers, but he didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he turned back to the papers on the desk. Among the bills and receipts, he found an old statement, a record of a payment he didn't remember. $5,000 cash for repairs on a Cadillac he'd never seen. His heart pounded. It wasn't his handwriting. It wasn't his business. Jack leaned back, his gaze falling on the blue case in the corner. Once it had held bullets, knives, surgical tools. Now it was empty, but Jack could feel the past seeping through the metal, like ghosts that never left. He realized his workshop was more than just a garage. It was a front. Someone was using him, his name, his life. And Emily knew more than she was letting on. He stood, his footsteps echoing in the empty workshop. Tomorrow he will begin searching for answers. No frantic movements. No emotion. Like a soldier, he would act coldly and calculatingly. Secrets would begin to emerge, and he would be ready. Chicago was walking slowly, its streets filled with the hum of morning streetcars and the smell of wet asphalt soaked by the night's rain. Jack Mercer's shop was silent, except for the faint creaking of the forklift and the muffled voice of the radio. Jack stood at the workbench, his oil-stained fingers clutching an old map of the city, lined with pencil marks that were traces of his past life. His eyes, circled with dark fatigue, burned with cold determination. Something had changed in him overnight. The conversation with Detective Lang, the envelope of money, Emily's words, all of it had come together to form a mosaic that he could no longer ignore. He was not the old Jack Mercer, the auto mechanic who fixed cars and paid taxes. He was again who he had once been, a hunter on a trail. The workshop hummed with its usual bustle. The air rang with the whir of the compressor, the clanking of tools, and the radio station that blared tire commercials and weather reports in the background. Oil stains spread across the floor like a battle map. Tony, his assistant, a guy with a tattoo of a snake wrapped around his neck, stood hunched over the hood of an old Dodge. "Damn thing," he grumbled. "That damn bolt's slipping again." "Use the 14 heads, not the 12. Jack responded automatically, without looking. "Everything here is as rusty as last year's coffin," Tony muttered, but obeyed. An elderly man in a worn jacket stood at the entrance, shifting from foot to foot. "The suspension is acting up. Everything rattles like in the subway," he complained, addressing the air rather than anyone in particular. "Yesterday, I almost flew off the road." Jack nodded absently, his eyes still on the unfolded map he held against his knee. His fingers gripped the edges tightly, as if he were holding not a piece of paper, but someone's neck. There were markers on the map, old and faded, but clear. A warehouse to the south where he'd once tracked a courier, a speakeasy in the old port district, a parking lot outside the city where one of his informants had disappeared. It wasn't just a map. It was a list of debts, places where memories never die. "Everything okay, Jack?" Tony asked, finally looking up from the engine. "Yes," he answered quickly, folding the map and tucking it into his inside pocket. Just remembering where to start. He wiped his hands on a rag, feeling the familiar stickiness, a mixture of engine oil and anxiety. His shirt was stuck to his back, soaked with sweat and gasoline. Everything about him was on edge, like a string about to snap. He knew where to go, and who to talk to. Jack folded the map and stuffed it into the pocket of his gray shirt, which smelled of sweat and gasoline. He knew he had to act. His conversation with Lang had shown that his shop was not just a business, but part of someone else's game. The envelope of money Emily had left behind was the first link. But who was pulling the strings? He decided to start with the one who might have the answers. Mark Childers, an old friend who had once written exposés and now wore a police badge. The police cafeteria on the corner of West Edison smelled of stale coffee and day-old donuts. Mark Childers sat in the corner, his broad shoulders hunched over a plastic table stained with ketchup. His face, lined with wrinkles, looked as if he hadn't slept in a week. He stirred his coffee with a spoon, looking at Jack with a tired grin. "You look like my old Ford ran you over," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. "What's wrong, Mercer?" Getting into trouble again? Jack forced a smile, but it came out crooked. He sat down across from him, his fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of his paper napkin. Add some cream, maybe it'll make the coffee bearable, he replied, trying to keep his tone light. But there was none of his usual irony in his voice. Long time no see, Childers. Thought you'd be retired by now, fishing by the lake. Mark chuckled, his eyes red from lack of sleep, studying Jack carefully. Family, work, he said, shrugging his shoulders. And you? What happened to our hero? Jack took a sip of coffee, wincing at the bitterness. He didn't know where to begin. Should he tell him about Lang? About the money? About Emily? He trusted Mark. They had been through a lot, back when Mark was a journalist reporting on corruption in City Hall, and Jack was helping him with information from his sources. But now it is more complicated. He didn't want to spill the beans, but he couldn't keep quiet either. I had visitors, he began, lowering his voice. The FBI, Detective Lang. He asked about the money that was going through my shop. Large sums in cash. I didn't notice anything like that, but... He paused, looking at Mark. Emily brought an envelope. Said it was from a colleague, but I don't believe her. Mark narrowed his eyes, his spoon hovering over his cup. He put it down and leaned closer. The FBI, you say? He said, his voice quieter. This is serious, Jack. If they're digging, then someone snitched. What's with the envelope? And what makes you think Emily's lying? Jack sighed, his fingers tightening on the napkin until it tore. He told her about the meeting with Lang, about the money, about Emily's strange behavior, her evasive answers, her late returns. He didn't mention Attorney Cole. He wasn't sure yet that wasn't just his paranoia. But Lang's words about large sums and Emily's envelope came together in his mind. I don't know who's behind this, he said, looking down at the table. But someone's using my workshop, and I want to find that son of a bitch. Mark leaned back, his face hardening. He pulled out a cigarette, but remembering that smoking was not allowed in the dining room, he tucked it behind his ear. You've always been stubborn, he said. But if the FBI is on your tail, don't rush in without preparation. Someone's playing you, Jack, and if Emily's in on this... He paused, looking at Jack. Are you sure you want to dig deeper? Jack felt a pang of pain inside him. Emily, his wife, the woman he loved, but love didn't blind him. He could see how she had changed her cold looks, her excuses, her late returns. He didn't want to believe she was betraying him, but the facts were against her. I must, he said quietly. If not me, then who? Mark nodded, his eyes darkening. Okay, where do we start? I can poke around the station, see if there's anything in your workshop. But if it's the FBI, my connections might not work. Jack thought about it. He remembered another man who might be able to help, Marcus King, a former Special Forces soldier he had worked with in Colombia. Marcus was a man who could find answers where others saw only shadows. There's this guy, Jack said. Marcus King. Used to work with me in the army. He's a private security guard now, but he still has connections. If anyone can find a lead, it's him. Mark chuckled, shaking his head. King, that psycho, he said. I remember him. A one-man army, but a real bastard. If he's in business, keep him on a short leash. Jack couldn't help but smile, remembering Colombia. The heat, the smell of gunpowder, the shouts in Spanish. He and Marcus had been slogging through the jungle to intercept a weapons shipment. Marcus had rushed ahead, distracting the guards while Jack had scrambled to the roof of the warehouse, clutching a grenade. One wrong move, and they would have been blown to pieces. But Marcus was as precise as a machine, and Jack trusted him more than anyone. Now Marcus was far away, but Jack knew he could find him if he needed him. He's quiet, Jack said. If anyone can dig deeper, it's him. Mark nodded, finishing his coffee. Okay, I'll talk to a couple of the guys at the station. If anything comes up, I'll let you know. But Jack, he looked him in the I didn't play the hero. If it's a big fish, you could drown. Jack didn't answer. He knew Mark was right, but backing down wasn't in his nature. He stood up, throwing a couple of dollars on the table for his coffee, and walked out of the cafeteria. The cold air hit his face, but he felt alive, for the first time in a long time. That evening, Jack returned home, his footsteps echoing in the empty living room. He turned on the old television, hoping to drown out his thoughts, but the screen showed a live broadcast of a political reception downtown. A fancy hotel, tuxedos, evening gowns, crystal chandeliers glittering. On the wall was a poster. Brian Cole, federal attorney who cares about Chicago. Jack froze, his fingers gripping his coffee mug so tightly that it cracked, hot liquid spilling onto the sofa. "There he is," he muttered, his voice low, almost growling. Cole walked into the frame, short, with a trim goatee, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than Jack made in a month. His smile was sharp as a blade, his eyes hard, like a man who knew he could get away with anything. He talked about the future of Chicago, about money that would make the city richer and stronger. But Jack wasn't listening. His eyes were on the figure behind Cole, Emily. Her red hair gleamed in the spotlight, her smile as artificial as the poster on the wall. She posed for the photographers, her hand on Cole's elbow, and the gesture cut Jack like a knife. He remembered the rumors he'd heard in the shop. The customers, chatting about politics, had mentioned Cole, an ambitious prosecutor with ambitions to run for senator. They said he was dishonest, that his campaign was being financed by shady sources. Jack hadn't paid attention to it then. But now, looking at Emily standing next to Cole, he realized these weren't rumors, they were true. His heart clenched, but the anger he expected did not come. Instead, he felt a cold clarity. The emotion was gone, leaving only steel, the same steel that had been in him when he held the rifle in Columbia. He knew he had to act. Not for revenge, not for Emily, for himself. Jack turned off the television, the screen going blank, leaving the room in darkness. He walked to the window, looking out at the city, which was ablaze with lights like distant stars. Somewhere out there was the truth, and he would find it, even if it meant opening doors he no longer had the keys for. Chicago was cold, its streets coated in a thin crust of morning fog that clung to the asphalt like a ghost of the past. Jack Mercer stood outside Autobaton, a small shop on the outskirts of town that he rented out to a friend named Rick, a guy with a permanently shiny smile and a habit of asking too many questions. The shop was an annex to a gas station that smelled of gasoline and cheap coffee, and Jack rarely went there. But nostalgia hadn't brought him here today. One of Rick's customers, a bleary-eyed truck driver, had hinted at strange transactions cash that passed through Autobaton but never reached his accounts. It was a clue, thin as a spider's web, but Jack knew that such threads often led to the truth. He adjusted the collar of his gray shirt, saturated with the smell of machine oil, and looked out at the street. Rusty signs, the blinking neon of a gas station, a couple of stray dogs rummaging through the garbage. The city was as tired as he was, but beneath that tiredness lurked danger. Jack could feel it in his skin, the same instinct that had saved him in the dusty camps of Eastern Europe when he was not a mechanic but a soldier. Today, he decided to return to those methods. The past was his weapon, and he was going to use it. Jack pulled out his phone, his fingers coated in oil and dust, but moving confidently. The screen lit up a gray background, an old contact marked Childers. He pressed call. 1 beep. 2. "Jack, you're early," Mark replied. His voice was hoarse, tired. That's the sound of someone who hasn't slept all night, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. "Have you found trouble yet?" "They find me themselves," Jack said, giving a half smile that no one saw. "We need to talk. In person." There was a brief pause on the other side. Jack could almost hear Mark sipping his cold coffee, running through his options, weighing the risks. "The old warehouse to the east in an hour," Mark finally said. "And Jack, don't go rushing into this without a plan. This isn't an army anymore. There's no cover." "I know," Jack answered quietly, although inside he knew he was already in hell. He just hadn't realized how deep yet. He disconnected the call and immediately dialed another number. The contact had no photo, but the name spoke for itself. King, legend, friend, destroyer. Beep, almost instantly answered. The background is the roar of waves, soft jazz, voices speaking Spanish. A sunny paradise somewhere on the edge of the world. Jack Mercer, Marcus King drawled, his voice as velvety as whiskey. If you're calling, it's bad. What happened? I need your help. Jack looked at the dusty window, the reflection a tired face, stubble, reddened eyes. But there was fire in them. Chicago, tomorrow. Can you do it? There was a chuckle on the other end. He imagined Marcus's grin, the one he always wore before jumping off a roof, defusing a bomb, or fighting 6 people in a narrow hallway. I'm in the Bahamas, bro. White sand, mosquitoes, girls with eyes like the night. But you don't just call. His voice became more serious. Just tell me you have a plan, not just an itch in your ass. There will be a plan, Jack said, or we'll make one. Just be here. Damn it, Marcus drawled. Okay, tomorrow. And Jack, if there's a woman involved, tell me right away. I've been twice as careful since then. She's involved, Jack admitted briefly, and maybe not alone. That's shit, Marcus said, almost kindly. See you later. The connection was lost, but Jack held the phone in his hand for a second. He felt a familiar tension slowly building in his chest. Not fear, not panic, focus. That same concentration that came only when everything around became personal. He stood up from the bench, brushed the dust off his pants, and took a deep breath. The wind carried the smell of gasoline and burning, rough but honest. Everything here was understandable. Everything here could be repaired. But there was another front ahead. The old warehouse, Mark. Questions he was afraid to answer. And behind it all, Emily, the woman he still loved, and who might have drawn him into a game where the stakes were more than just feelings. And now Marcus is going to town. And that means the hunt begins. Jack spent the morning walking old trails, places where he had once gathered information for operations. His first stop was a shady auto repair shop on the south side, rumored to be a place where stolen parts were sold. The place smelled of welding and rancid oil, and the bulletin board was filled with wanted posters for the FBI. Jack noticed his name in the corner of one, not a picture, but a reference. Mercer, auto mechanic, possible connection to illegal transactions. His heart sank, but he forced himself to smile at the mechanic, who eyed him suspiciously. Just looking for parts, Jack said with a shrug, for a '98 Ford. The mechanic muttered something and turned away, but Jack caught him exchanging a glance with another worker. They knew more than they were saying. He walked out, leaving behind the smell of metal and the feeling of being watched. Then he stopped at a couple of stands near the docks, where locals gossiped about the goings-on in town. An old man selling hot dogs mentioned big money swirling around the new prosecutor, but he fell silent when Jack tried to elaborate. I heard someone's been buying up businesses, the old man said, looking away, but it's none of my business. Jack nodded, but his mind was already racing to a name, Brian Cole. By midday, he was meeting Blake Barnes, a Chicago Tribune reporter who had once helped him with information. Blake was sitting in a diner littered with papers and empty coffee cups. His face was tired, but his eyes were curious. "You back in business, Mercer?" Blake asked, pushing his laptop away. "I heard the FBI is digging under your garage." "Not mine," Jack said, lowering his voice. "Someone else's. What do you know about Cole?" Blake narrowed his eyes, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "The prosecutor, ambitious son of a bitch," he said. "They say his Senate campaign is financed by dirty money, but there is no evidence. If you have something, share it." Jack shook his head. He wasn't ready to share yet, but Blake's words confirmed his suspicions. Cole wasn't just a politician. He was a player, and Emily seemed to be part of his game. The last item on the list was a call to Teresa Collins, the hacker who had once helped Jack hack into the databases for the operation. Her voice was as sharp as ever. "Mercer, you owe me a beer," she said. "What do you want?" Check the accounts, Jack said. My shop. Find out who's transferring the money, and see if there's a trace of Cole. Teresa chuckled. It'll be expensive, she said. But I'm in. Give me a couple of days. Jack hung up, feeling the puzzle begin to fall into place. But one detail nagged at him. Emily. He remembered overhearing her on the phone a few days ago. She spoke softly, but he caught snippets of her words. Too slow, needs to go faster. At the time, he'd thought it was about work. Now, he saw it in a different light. By evening, Jack had finally made up his mind. He had done what he had been avoiding ever since he quit and vowed to stay away from bureaucracy and men in suits. He had driven to the FBI office. Along the way, phrases and options were spinning in his head: how to start a conversation, what words not to say so as not to provoke someone too much. His fingers were clenched on the steering wheel, his knuckles were white, and his shoulders were heavy. His own face was reflected in the rearview mirror. Tired, cut with lines of tension, with narrowed eyes, a hunter who himself became the prey. When he entered the building, a cold, impersonal smell hit him in the nose. Disinfectant, old paper, someone else's coffee. The light from the overhead lamps was in his eyes, burning out the shadows. Metal and white plastic were everywhere. Everything here said, "You are under surveillance." Lang met him in a narrow office with peeling walls and two fans that didn't work. The desk was piled high with folders, coffee cups, and a stack of printouts with notes on them, redacted. The agent sat with a straight posture, but seemed tired not from life, but from people. One of those who never moves his face unless necessary, a predator who has learned to wait. "Mr. Mercer," he said, leaning back in his chair. A smile barely touched his lips, but there was no warmth in his eyes, only a coldness, like in a dead winter forest. "I didn't expect you so soon. Any news?" "I don't," Jack said, dropping into the hard metal chair opposite him. "You should be, and I'm not here as a suspect. I'm here as the man whose workshop has suddenly found itself under your microscope, and I want to know why." Lang tapped his fingers on the table, the rhythm measured and precise. "You're stubborn," he said finally. "It's neither good nor bad. It's predictable. You worked for us once, Mercer. You know how circles work. Everything crisscrosses. Everything comes back. Don't philosophize. I'm asking you straight. My workshop. Who's watching it? Why? And most importantly, who's at the top of that dirty list? Let's just say," Lang said slowly, leaning forward slightly, "we're keeping an eye on someone who matters, and your workshop is one of the intersections. You are not the target. Yet. By sounds like a threat." "No," Lang corrected. "It's an opportunity to stay away." Jack narrowed his eyes. His voice became harsher, almost metallic. "I'm not one to stand by while everything around me sinks, especially when it comes to Emily or anything around her." Lang was silent for a moment. Then he suddenly changed the subject, too suddenly to be accidental. "Tomorrow, Brian Cole's reception. He's the man everyone is drawn to. Politicians, financiers, former and current. He loves being in the center. There will be a lot of interesting things there. We recommend you be there. As a guest, of course. Watch who's with whom, who says what, who leaves with whom." "Cole," Jack repeated. The name was coming again. Too often. Too easily. He felt a spark ignite inside him. A connection was forming, but not in words yet. Just instinct. He stood up. "I will think." "Think quickly," Lang said. "And Mercer, if you do decide to show up, play nice, without your soldierly manners." "If I'm in the game," Jack said, turning toward the door, "I want to know the rules." Lang chuckled, leaning over to pick up a new folder. "The rules are simple. Don't bother us, and maybe you'll get out of this clean. Maybe." Jack didn't answer. He just walked out, feeling as if the dust in his lungs had grown heavier. Outside, the city was already getting ready for sleep, but inside, other things were waking up. Cole's appointment. He already knew he was going. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. Jack walked home, his footsteps echoing in the empty alleys. The headlights of the cars were blinding, reflecting in the puddles like blood in the twilight. He thought about Cole, about his speeches, about Emily standing next to him on the TV screen. "Look, we have the money to turn this city into a model state," Cole had said. But Jack knew there was dirt behind those words, and he was going to drag that dirt into the light. At home, he couldn't sleep. He sat on his bed, looking at the tuxedo hanging in the closet. His mind was far away in Colombia, in Poland, in the days when he had been a hunter. Now he was becoming one again. Morning would call, and he would be ready. Chicago was in the twilight, its streets glittering from a recent rain, reflecting the neon signs and headlights like broken mirrors. Jack Mercer stood at the old dock by the river, where rusty barges bobbed and the air smelled of damp steel and mud. He had come here to meet Marcus King, a man who knew how to find the truth in the darkest corners. Jack felt the time tightening, like a spring about to snap. Brian Cole's party was tonight, and he had to be ready. His plan, not yet fully formed, was beginning to take shape. Gather evidence, infiltrate the party, find a lead that would link Cole, Emily, and the money that flowed through his shop. Jack adjusted the collar of his gasoline-scented jacket and looked out at the river. The water was as black as his thoughts, broken only by the occasional glimmer of streetlights. He remembered overhearing Emily on the phone a few days ago, her voice quiet and tense. "Too slow, we need to go faster." He'd thought it was about work. Now he knew it was about something else. About Cole. About money. About betrayal. The footsteps behind him were almost inaudible, but Jack immediately felt the movement. His instincts were right. He turned around, his hand slid to his belt not for a weapon, but simply out of habit, reflexively. Marcus King emerged from the darkness. The silhouette was painfully familiar. Tall, angular, with the gait of a confident predator who never runs, he walks. Calmly, too calmly, he was wearing a worn leather jacket, and in his hand was an unlit cigar with a bitten edge. The scars on his face, as if cut with a knife into old skin, glowed silver under the streetlight. He still looked as if he could survive anywhere on the planet without a passport, food or clothes, just with his own frown and a few phrases. "Jack Mercer," he said, his voice hoarse and drawn out like a drag. "If you got me out of the Bahamas, you're in trouble. Come on, spill it." Jack looked him in the eye in silence. Much time had passed, and although the memories of the Colombian jungle, of shots at dawn, and the smell of burning between torn palms lived in both of them, he knew that time changes people, even the most reliable, especially them. He paused, and then he began to speak. "Cole," Jack said, lowering his voice. "A prosecutor, the kind who makes a career out of big cases. The money comes through my shop. I'm not sure, but I think Emily's involved somehow. Maybe not willingly, maybe knowingly. I'm going to see Cole this evening. I want to find out who's pulling the strings." Marcus frowned. His fingers tightened on the cigar, the roll cracking. "Cole, the one running for the Senate." He raised an eyebrow. "Damn, Jack. That's no minnow. That's a shark, only clean-shaven. And your wife." He trailed off. "Are you sure?" The pain flared suddenly, like a burn. Jack looked away. He wasn't sure. Not of her. Not of himself. But the details, the gestures, the envelope, the shadow in her voice, the photo from the reception where she stood too close to Cole, all added up to a picture that was too clear. "I have to know," Jack said. "To the end, even if I don't like the answer." Marcus chuckled, his lips twisting into a smirk. But there was coldness in his eyes, old as the night before the battle. "You haven't changed. Still the same stubborn son of a bitch. Fine, I'm in. But keep in mind, if everything collapses, we don't pull each other out. We just hold the line, like before." He paused, then added with his usual confidence. "There's one guy, nickname Molly, local channel, trades information, quickly, without much morality, lives between truth and fiction, drives a beat-up pickup with the sign Black Lemon, usually parked at the gas station on your street. Autobaton, I think. He hears who's handling money and where. Just be careful, got it?" This Molly is like a nervous dog. If he feels threatened, he'll hide in a crack, and you won't be able to get him out." Jack nodded. The name stuck in his mind. He'd heard it before, in whispers, in the phone recording Lang had intercepted, or in the security printout Mark Childers had shown him briefly before tucking it back into the folder. He didn't tell Marcus anything. Yet, not because he didn't trust him, but because he had to go from behind. Even his friends. "Thank you," Jack said briefly. Marcus slapped him on the shoulder, hard, almost painfully. Then he took a step back, turning toward the shadow. "I'm here if it gets hot. But remember, there are no medals here, just bullets." "As always," Jack replied. Marcus disappeared into the darkness of the dock, leaving behind a faint scent of cheap cigar, salt, and old metal. Jack watched him go. Then he exhaled slowly, feeling the blood pounding in his ears, his pulse quickening. He knew that feeling, before the operation, when everything is just beginning. He turned and headed towards the gas station. Small. First goal. And if he was right, the chain will begin to unfold right now. By evening, Jack was back in his office at the shop, a cramped room cluttered with papers and tools. He avoided the repair area where Tony and the other workers worked on cars, so as not to attract attention. His desk was covered with invoices, receipts, and copies of documents he'd received from Teresa Collins. She'd hacked into his shop's database and found traces of transactions he'd disapproved of transfers to offshore accounts disguised as payments for parts. Lang, after much coaxing, gave him surveillance footage from his garage. One showed a pickup truck parked outside Autobaton at night, and a figure handing something to Rick, its tenant. Jack switched on the desk lamp, its light cutting into his eyes, casting shadows on the yellowed walls. He took out a pack of cigarettes, then thought better of it and put it aside. Instead, he opened the metal briefcase he kept in his desk drawer. Inside were not weapons, but tools from his past, a tape recorder, a miniature camera, a set of lock picks. He had no intention of going to the reception with a bat or a gun. That would have been too rude. Jack knew that truth requires precision, not force. He glanced at his watch. 10:47 p.m. His phone vibrated, and a message from Marcus appeared on the screen. "First door at reception. Look for the guy in the red shirt. He knows Cole." Jack frowned. The guy in the red shirt was too vague, but he trusted Marcus. He replied, "Got it. I'll be there." His heart beat steadily, but inside he felt a storm building. He remembered Columbia, the night he and Marcus had snuck through a warehouse surrounded by guards. Jack held the rifle, his fingers shaking not from fear, but from tension. One false step and they'd done it. But they'd done it. He'd trusted his instincts then. Now he had to do the same. Jack stood up, his shadow falling on the pile of papers. He gathered up the documents, tucked the recorder into his jacket pocket, and walked out of the office. The city greeted him with a cold wind and the hum of cars. Cole's party was downtown at the Palmer House Hotel, where everyone who wanted a piece of power gathered. Jack knew this was his chance, not for revenge, but for the truth. Chicago was shining in the night, its skyscrapers reflecting the moonlight, but inside the Palmer House Hotel it was another world, a world of crystal chandeliers, expensive champagne, and fake smiles. The ballroom was crowded, men in tuxedos, women in evening gowns, their voices merging into a hum like a beehive. On the walls were posters of Brian Cole, the federal prosecutor, the senatorial candidate, the man whose smile hid the dirt. Jack Mercer slipped inside almost unnoticed, his dark suit blending into the crowd, his face a mask of calm. But inside, a storm was raging. He had spent the day preparing for this moment. That morning, after his meeting with Marcus King, he had received the final pieces of evidence from Teresa Collins. Bank records showing transfers from offshore accounts to a shell company linked to Cole, and a video from a security camera outside the Autobaton of Emily handing an envelope to a man in the shadows. The man's face was blurry, but the voice low, confident was Cole's. "It's clean," Emily said on the tape, and the words cut Jack like a knife. He gave the tape to Blake Barnes, a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, with one request: release the story during the reception. That was his plan, not a shootout, not a fight, but the truth that would hit harder than a bullet. Jack stood against the wall, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Emily was at the front, wearing a black dress that accentuated her paleness. Her fingers were wrapped around a glass of wine, but the smile that was usually so bright was gone. She looked tense, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected trouble. Jack felt his heart tighten. He had loved her once, loved her so much he would have died for her. But now he saw her as someone else, part of a game that was ruining his life. Brian Cole came out on stage, his suit costing more than Jack's workshop took in a year. His voice was smooth, honed like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, raising his glass, "thank you for being here. Today we take a step toward a new Chicago, a city of opportunity, a city of strength." The crowd applauded, but Jack noticed some of the guests exchanging glances, their faces filled with skepticism. He knew Blake was somewhere in the room, ready to release the story. Jack waited for the signal, the flash of cameras, the noise of the crowd, the moment when the truth would come out. The man in the red shirt stood at the entrance to the all-night gas station, as if he were just waiting for a car or smoking a cigarette, but Jack saw the signs. Quick eyes, constant glances around, back too straight, tense fingers fiddling with the fabric. A man who was used to being afraid, and probably had reasons to be. Small. That's how Marcus described him. Thin, quick, with eyes that move before his mouth can speak. An information conduit. Not a criminal, not a witness, just mercury sliding between layers of urban darkness. Jack approached him, slowly but decisively. His movements were precise, almost predatory, like those of a hunter who doesn't want to scare, but won't wait either. "Are you little?" he asked quietly, without coming too close. The kid turned around. His face was long, with a shadow of stubble and the yellowish skin of a man who had long lived on coffee, cigarettes, and fear. His eyes darted to Jack's face, to his shoulders, to his empty hands, and, most importantly, behind his back. Everything he needed to know, he read instantly. He nodded, barely noticeable, as if he was afraid that the word itself would become a death sentence. "King said you could help," Jack continued, his voice low and even almost friendly. Almost. The kid swallowed, his fingers still clutching the edge of his shirt, crumpled like a napkin after a heated interrogation. "I need to know who's behind Cole," Jack said. "Not before the election. Not at the rumor level. I need people, money, schemes." The kid looked back again, now with obvious panic. Then he took a step to the side, gesturing for them to follow him. They rounded the gas station building and found themselves in the shadows of the garbage bins, where an old air conditioner hummed. The noise drowned out their voices, which suited them both. "It's not just Cole," the kid whispered, barely opening his mouth. "He's a storefront on Main Street. Behind him, net, big money. Not local. Latinos, maybe Balkans, who the hell knows. Smart. They pay for silence, buy their own, leak strangers." Jack didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He just looked. The kid scratched his neck nervously. "They use your garage. Dirty money flows through supplies. Auto parts, fake metal, fake accounts. Everything is clean on paper, at least until someone starts digging." "Who dug?" Jack asked. "One guy from the tax office. Not for long. Transferred. The other one is a former policeman. Now, he's on the missing list." The kid paused. Then he exhaled and added, "And your wife, she's not just there. She's their liaison. Oversees the transfers, checks the routes. Knows who's coming and when. I saw her. Twice. She personally handed over the briefcase in the warehouse, behind Sinclair Road. Cole was there too." Jack felt a chill run through his insides. It was impossible not to feel the blood drain from his fingers. He wanted to ask, "You are sure?" but that would be a stupid question. People like Molly don't get confused by details. Not like these. "Does she look like she's afraid?" Jack asked quietly. "Or like she's working?" The little one hesitated. Then he nodded. "At first, yes, I was afraid. Now, she's become quieter, more careful, as if she knows what she's doing. Or decide no. These are different things. Jack closed his eyes for a second, breathing in the smell of hot asphalt and trash. Everything was shrinking. The picture he hadn't wanted to finish was now becoming clear. "You didn't tell anyone?" he asked. "King is the only one I still trust," muttered the kid. "And now, apparently, you do too. But listen, Mercer, I helped you, right? So, if they find out that I leaked even a word, they'll find me in a ditch with a gag in my mouth and concrete boots. Then don't stay here," Jack said. "Get lost. At least for a while. A month. I'll find you later, if anything." The little one smiled crookedly. "As if I didn't start packing my bag 3 days ago. You think I'm just standing there in a red shirt like a target?" He stepped to the side, then froze. "The last thing, if you go to a reception, look into the room. Not at Cole, but beyond him. Those who pull the strings don't shine on the covers. They stand in the shadows, watching, remembering. One look and you're already on the list." He disappeared into the darkness faster than Jack could say anything in response. Jack stood against the wall, feeling a hum building inside him, not fear, but focused rage. He had no proof, no names yet, but he had an entry point, and maybe a reason Emily had changed. Now to the reception, which means right into the jaws. Jack felt his blood run cold. He knew it, but hearing the confirmation was like a blow. He nodded to Kid and walked away, his thoughts whirling. At that moment, the room exploded with noise. On the large screen behind Cole, designed for his presentation, an image appeared, the same camera footage. Emily handing over the envelope. Cole's voice, "All clear." The crowd froze, the hum of voices turning to silence. Cole turned, his face pale, his wine glass falling from his hand, shattering on the stage. Jack stepped forward, his steps firm as a soldier's. He had no intention of shooting or fighting. His weapon was truth. "This is your city of opportunity, Cole," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Mafia money flowing through my shop. You and my wife thought I wouldn't notice?" The room buzzed. Emily looked at him, her eyes full of horror and tears. She stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Jack, it's not what you think," she said, but the words sounded empty. Cole tried to keep his face straight, his smile strained. "It's a lie," he said to the crowd. "It's a fake. Mr. Mercer, you." But he was interrupted by the voice of Blake Barnes, who came onto the stage with a microphone. "We have the documents," Blake said, his tone sharp. "Transfers, invoices, records. It's all in the Tribune office. It'll be on the front page tomorrow." The crowd erupted in shouts. Jack saw Cole's bodyguard, a large man named Walter, move toward him. Walter was the prosecutor's right-hand man, his shadow, always out of the way. Jack knew him, he'd seen him a couple of times outside the shop, taking Cole's car. Now his eyes were blazing with rage. "Get him out," Cole hissed, but Walter was already there. Jack ducked his blow, his movements quick, honed by years of training. He grabbed Walter's arm, twisted it, and pushed him against the wall. The crowd gasped, but Jack wasn't looking at them. His gaze was fixed on Emily. "Why?" he asked quietly, his voice full of pain. Emily was silent, her face wet with tears. She took a step toward him, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "No need," he said. "I saw everything." He turned and walked toward the exit, feeling the crowd part before him. His heart beat steadily, but inside he was empty. The truth had surfaced, but it brought no relief, only cold. It was cold outside. That special, piercing cold that doesn't bite your skin, but slowly seeps inside, into your bones, into your breath. The fog lay low, like a shroud, covering the city, hiding its unevenness and sins. The light from the few street lamps dissipated in the whitish haze, turning into dim halos hanging over the empty streets. Jack walked along the wet asphalt. Each step he took echoed dully, as if even the earth was tired of the sounds. Drops of rain clung to the collar of his coat, ran down his cheeks, mixing with sweat, dust, maybe tears. He didn't know. He didn't check. The thoughts in his head were like shadows in a basement, slow and lingering. He thought about the past, about things that now seemed almost imaginary, about nights with Emily when she laughed, when she snuggled up to him under the covers, when she called him a aeronaut out of politeness, not out of duty, but sincerely, naively, truly. Now it was dead, like the city around it. She had made her choice, or she had been forced to. He still didn't know for sure, and maybe he didn't want to know anymore, because the truth doesn't always heal. Sometimes it just makes the wound cleaner and deeper. He stopped at the river bank. The wind off the water was sharp, smelling of iron and damp rust. The water was black, thick as oil. There was no current, only occasional ripples, like the breath of a sleeping creature beneath the surface. Somewhere down there, in the depths, was his life, the one he had lost, or let go of. He didn't know which was worse, but he was alive, standing, breathing, and that was enough. To begin with, he took a lighter out of his pocket, clicked it, and lit a cigarette. The flame illuminated his face for a second, tired, with deep wrinkles around his eyes, with sharp cheekbones. The face of a man who had been through hell and had not asked for directions back. Behind him is the FBI, Lang, Cole. The network will fall apart, or they'll just move it to other streets. This isn't his fight anymore. He did what he could. He gave them tips, showed them where to dig. What's next isn't his war. Ahead is emptiness, or freedom. Sometimes there is no difference. He took a drag and blew the smoke out into the night. "Goodbye, Emily," he said, not loudly but clearly. "Thank you for everything, and sorry for the rest." He turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed on the wet asphalt again, one after another, like a countdown. There was a road ahead, not new, not clean, but his, without labels, without legends, without illusions. And there was truth in this, even if it was bitter, even if it's the last one. Chicago was walking slowly, its streets shrouded in a gray fog that clung to rusty signs and wet asphalt like a ghost of the past. The first light of day was sharp, reflecting in puddles like shards of a broken mirror. Jack Mercer stood at the entrance to his shop, his breath mingling with the cold air. His face, lined with fatigue, was calm, but there was an emptiness in his eyes, not the kind that comes from despair, but the kind that comes when all bridges have been burned. He looked at the Mercer auto sign hanging above the door and thought that it didn't belong to him anymore, not like it used to. The night at the Palmer house changed everything. Brian Cole, the federal prosecutor whose smile was plastered on the posters, was arrested on the scene as the security footage and documents leaked to the Chicago Tribune by Blake Barnes hit the news. The headlines screamed of corruption, of mob money, of Jack's workshop becoming a front for laundering. The FBI, led by Lang, descended on the courtroom like a pack of wolves, and Cole, still trying to justify himself, was led away in handcuffs. Emily disappeared that same night. She never came home, never called, never left a note. Jack never looked for her. She had betrayed him his life, his trust, his love, and now she would have to answer for her choices, wherever she was. Jack walked into the shop, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. Tony, his assistant, had quit the day after the appointment, saying he didn't want to work at a place that was in the papers. The customers had stopped calling, their cars no longer lined up at the gate. The city that had once been Jack's home had turned its back on him. He felt it in every glance from passers-by, every whisper at the gas station, every headline that mentioned his name next to Cole's. Chicago had become a stranger, and Jack knew his time here was over. He walked into the office, which still smelled of machine oil and old coffee. There was a stack of papers on the desk, bills, receipts, letters from his lawyer. After Cole's arrest, Lang had called Jack into the FBI to clear up the details. The conversation had been short but difficult. Lang had confirmed that the shop had been used to launder money, but Jack was not under investigation. "You're clean, Mercer," he had said, his voice cold as steel. "But your business, it's toxic now. I suggest you start over." Jack nodded without arguing. He knew Lang was right. The shop, his rock, his life, had been destroyed. Not by Cole, not by Emily, but by his own blindness. Among the papers was a letter from the lawyer Jack had hired through Mark Childers. A divorce from Emily was imminent, but her disappearance made the process more difficult. In Illinois, a divorce without a spouse was possible if you could prove that the other party was uncooperative. Jack filed for a summary divorce, citing that Emily had left town and was not answering his calls. The lawyer, an older man with tired eyes, sent notices to Emily's last known address, but as expected, there was no response. The court scheduled a hearing for a month later, but Jack knew Emily would not show up. She had been part of Cole's world, a world of lies and money, and now that world had collapsed. The divorce was a formality, but he wanted to complete it, to erase the last link between him and her. He signed the papers, leaving them on the table, and felt the weight he had been carrying for years lighten a little. Jack opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of old photographs tied with a rubber band. He had found them yesterday while sorting through his bedroom. In one of them, he and Emily were standing by Lake Michigan, their faces aglow with laughter. This was before all of this, before the money, before the lies, before the night at the Palmer house. He ran his finger over her face in the picture, feeling a shadow of pain stir inside him. He loved her, but the Emily he knew had disappeared long before that night. He put the photographs back in the drawer, not intending to take them with him. The past belonged here, in this town he could no longer call home. The fog outside was thickening, hiding the skyscrapers and muffling the sounds of the city. Jack stepped outside, his boots crunching on the gravel. He paused at the entrance to the workshop, looking at the sign. It was battered, the paint peeling, but he had once been proud of it. Now it seemed foreign, like everything else. He took his keys from his pocket and dropped them into a puddle. They jingled, disappearing into the murky water, like his old life. He walked down the street, his shadow trailing behind him, dissolving into the fog. The city was silent, except for the occasional sound of a distant car horn, a squeak of a streetcar, the whisper of the wind. Jack remembered Marcus King's words at the dock. "You haven't changed, Mercer. Still the same stubborn son of a bitch." Marcus was right. Jack wasn't looking for glory, wasn't trying to be a hero. He was simply doing what he had to do. And now that the truth had come out, he was free not from pain, not from the past, but from illusions. He thought of Lang, of his cold eyes and his warning. The FBI had closed the Cole case, but Jack knew the shadows of the mafia were still out there, somewhere in the Chicago alleys. He wasn't going to chase them. This wasn't his war. His battle had ended the moment he'd walked onto the stage and looked into Emily's eyes. He'd seen fear, guilt, but no love, and that was enough. Jack stopped by the river, its black water reflecting the first rays of sun breaking through the fog. He remembered Columbia, the night he and Marcus had walked through the jungle, their breaths mingling with the hot air. He had known then who was friend and who was foe. Now the lines were as blurred as this fog. He exhaled, his breath a cloud of steam, and for the first time in a long time he felt alive. He didn't know where he would go. Maybe west, to the mountains, where the air was cleaner and people didn't ask questions. Maybe south, where it was warm and no one knew his name. But he knew one thing: Chicago was no longer his place. He had left the studio Emily, his past in this city that had once been his home. He was alone now, but that didn't frighten him. Solitude was his old friend. Jack turned and walked away, his steps disappearing into the morning mist. The city was fading behind him, like a dream he didn't want to remember. Everything was new at dawn, not better, not worse, just different. And that was enough. Thank you for being with me until the end of this story. If you liked it, give it a like, write a few words in the comments, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. Each of your responses is a powerful boost of inspiration for new stories. See you soon. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.